Hello and welcome to Politics Today, and in this programme we are going to be discussing the role of Sharia courts in the UK, especially since the Home Office has launched an independent review of Sharia courts and the practice of Sharia law in the UK, plus also Baroness Coxs in the House of Lords has also launched her own bill on this issue. So we're saying, is Sharia law compatible with British law? And to answer these very important questions, I'm joined today by Dieppe, who is the Director of Islamic Affairs at Christian Concern. Tim, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Tim, can you share something about your background and how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and where your interest in Islam really stems from?
Well, that is a long question. How long have you got for that, Simon? I mean,
the programme's 26 minutes, so...
I grew up in a church-going family, actually. I went to church every week and to Crusaders as well, and I heard a lot of Bible stories that way. And then it wasn't until I was a young teenager or so that I first heard somebody explain to me why Jesus died on a cross, and that it was for my forgiveness and to enable me to have a relationship with him and things. And it all sort of clicked in my mind, and I thought, gosh, this is what it's all about. This is why it all makes sense. And I responded at that point, and I knew that there was something real there, and I felt it, but I never got any backing or any follow-up. I was like a seed that was not well planted in Jesus' parable, and I gave up on it quite quickly, and spent most of my teenage years as an atheist. Then became quite a convinced and quite a well-thought-through atheist, decided free will was an illusion, and various things like that. It wasn't until I came across Christians who were able to explain some of the apologetics and say evidence for Christianity, evidence for the resurrection, evidence for the Bible, and things that made me think, actually, deep down, I know that this is really true, and now I've got the reasons, now I've got the ways to explain it, and I recommitted myself at that point, and I've been going since then. So then, amazing. You're going into Islam. So I had read the Quran and various things, but I knew not very much about Islam. When I watched what happened on 9/11 nearly 15 years ago today, I was shocked. And I had heard of suicide bombers before, but I'd sort of dismissed them as poor, illiterate, easily manipulable people who would do such things. And what I saw there was highly educated, well-trained, well-paid people deciding to commit such an atrocity and destroy their own lives along with many other lives in the process. And I thought, gosh, what is this worldview that can do that to people and can actually motivate people to do this? I need to understand this. And so I started a project, I suppose, of studying Islam, reading about Islam, trying to understand what this is all about, how it works, what Islam teaches, how it motivates people, and so on. And I became more concerned as I went through that, and then I was working in finance as a fund manager, and I thought, you know what, I ought to understand Sharia finance as well. So I started reading about Islamic finance as well. In the course of that study of Islamic finance, I came across a chap called Taqi Usmani, who was a leading figure in Islamic finance in the world still today, and he's written a book in English, and in this book he's asked a question: do we still need to wage jihad in a country like Britain where we can freely build mosques and preach Islam? And Taqi Usmani says, well, according to the Quran, killing should continue until they pay the jizya tax. That's the subjugation tax. And it actually, he says that it doesn't say killing should continue until we can preach Islam and build mosques. It says killing should continue until they pay the jizya. So I wrote to a friend at HSBC and said, do you think this man should really be on your Sharia advisory board, which he was? And he wrote to his compliance person, and they ended up getting rid of him on that board. They left his son on that board and all the other imams on that board. But that sort of opened my eyes to something about what's behind this broader agenda of Sharia in finance and Sharia in other contexts, and so on. And I started praying for more opportunity to talk about Islam and Sharia law. Then I was asked to run a Sharia fund. Wasn't the answer to prayer I wanted, but still I said no for various reasons. I would have been endorsing Sharia as a system, and I didn't have much support from my colleagues at that time. It was a difficult time for me, and that ended connecting me with other people like Christian Concern and other people involved in Islam, and I became more involved with other people in responding to Islam, and ultimately got asked by Christian Concern, would you come and work for us to help raise the profile of this issue? Excellent,
and of course our viewers are very familiar with Christian Concern. Many representatives from the organisation like Andrew and others are regulars on this programme, and other other programs on Revelation TV, because we all support the incredible work they're doing in protecting and defending Christian freedoms in the UK.
Yeah,
obviously, when you look at kind of Sharia finance, and it's something called an Islamic dawah, isn't it, where certain money money that is raised through Sharia finance goes to Islamic charities. So there's a great concern then that a lot of this money then can be diverted into terrorism and terrorist activities. And once you accept Sharia financing, then you accept all aspects of Sharia law. Because in today's programme we're discussing the role of Sharia courts in the UK and the practice of Sharia law in this country. It's making the kind of news headlines, and it will make further news headlines, I think, later as we go on in the parliamentary year in the autumn. But I have to really ask you, what is Sharia law, and in particular, how do Sharia courts operate?
Okay, so Sharia law is basically their system or set of rules for which Muslims to live by, and it covers all sorts of areas. In fact, it's very prescriptive, covers all sorts of areas and things they should do and how they should do things and ways in which people should live and so on. So Islam is a very prescriptive religion. It actually tells you what to do and how to do all sorts of things. And what you find if you go to Islamic websites for fatwas, they're saying, what's the ruling on this, or what's the ruling on that, what's the ruling on the other, because there's rulings for nearly everything out there. So Sharia law is a whole system, and it's based on the Quran to start with, and then the Hadith, and then other rulings that interpret those things as well. So then you're talking about Sharia courts. So there is a system, a network of Sharia courts in this country today that's established itself, and they make rulings on Sharia law for people. And the most prevalent use of that is for divorce. More than 90% of people who are going for rulings in these courts are women saying, I want a divorce from my husband. Now, there's a problem immediately there, because in Sharia law, divorce is much easier for the husband than it is for the woman. The husband, it's well known, only has to say, I divorce you 3 times, and the woman is formally divorced, that's it. The woman, much more difficult, much more elaborate, difficult process to go through. And so the woman will come to this Sharia court saying, I want a divorce from my husband for various reasons. It may be an abusive marriage that she's in, and the Sharia courts will make a ruling based on Sharia law for that. And that's the primary use which they come to, and then they do sometimes stray into other areas as well, but that's the main use of them.
Excellent. Those who advocate Sharia courts say that you provide religious and cultural freedom for Muslims in the UK. What are your concerns about the role and the practice of Sharia courts?
Okay, so the difficulty with Sharia courts is that it creates a parallel legal system effectively, and one that is very clearly discriminating against women. In the Quran, it explicitly says that a woman's voice is only worth half that of a man's voice. There. So that's straight in the Quran. So you can tell if you're abiding by Sharia law, you're only going to listen to a woman half as much as you listen to a man. You need 2 women to stand up to 1 man. And these women do not have a woman supporting them in that way. And then in the Quran, it says a husband can beat her wife, his wife, as well. That's explicit in the Quran. So then we know that Sharia court judges have said a man should not be questioned as to why he beat his wife. That's what some of these judges have said. And then you've got polygamy as well, and then inheritance issues as well, and child custody issues as well. So there's a system that's grown up here that is systematically discriminating against women in these ways, and that should not be allowed, and that is clearly not compatible with British law and with English law, and we need to find out and look about how we can stop this.
Absolutely. But when it comes down to the practice of Sharia courts and the practice of Sharia law in the UK, obviously many Muslims want this because they feel this is a cultural and religious expression of their beliefs and the practice of their beliefs. But it's also supported by a large number of liberals in this country who support Muslims being able to have these parallel legal system known as Sharia courts. Are they blind to the evidence of these courts and how they discriminate against women? And why do they endorse them?
I'm struggling to understand why people who ostensibly are liberal, as you say, and would campaign for women's rights in other issues would actually say we should support a court like this that we know discriminates against women in various ways. I honestly struggle to understand why people would endorse it, why people would want it, why people would want to allow it. In fact, even in Islamic countries, they're not allowed as much freedom as they are in this country. in Islamic countries, in many Islamic countries, you are forced to register a marriage civilly in law and divorces as well. And then we have Sharia courts in this country, and some of them do not recognise a civil divorce as a divorce in Sharia law. Now, that's not allowed in Pakistan, for example. It's not allowed in Malaysia and various other Islamic countries. In this country, we've bowled over backwards saying, oh, yeah, you can do what you want and don't worry about this. Now, we should be doing something about this. We should be saying you're not allowed to make rulings that have any legal effect that discriminate against women in the way in which that ruling is carried out. And we should be standing for principles and values that actually are founded on Christian principles in the end of equality before the law, because we're all in the image of God, of equality between men and women, again, because we're both in the image of God, and saying that that's how this society is founded. And if you come and live in this society, you should abide by the law of the land and not try and set up your own law, try and set up a different legal system.
Absolutely. When it comes down to the practice of Sharia courts, and are they legally binding and are they compatible with UK law?
So they're not compatible with UK law because of the way in which they discriminate against women. That's absolutely clear. Are they legally binding? They're actually ruling on Sharia things. So no, they're not in the sense of they're not actually ruling on English law. But there are cases where they have strayed over and ruled on inheritance or ruled on someone who's actually committed physical harm or something like that. And in those cases, they shouldn't be doing that, and they're actually encroaching on boundaries that they shouldn't be doing. And their rulings should not have effect, but they are acted upon as if they do have effect.
Tim, I was very surprised in the course of researching for this programme that apparently, according to the Daily Mail, there are 85 Sharia courts in the UK. How did the British government permit these to be operational in the first place, and how have they managed to expand to such a large number?
Okay, so 85 is a well publicised estimate of the number. Part of the problem is you don't really know how many there are, because they could be anywhere. They could be held in all sorts of different contexts, in mosques or in Islamic communities. Or I've heard larger and smaller estimates of the number of Sharia courts that are out there. But certainly, it's a growing thing that's happened. Why has it been allowed? The government, I think, has deliberately turned a blind eye to it. Has deliberately said we don't want to involve ourselves in this thing. The government tends to not want to involve itself in religious affairs, which is understandable to some degree. And then you've had high-profile people like Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who said we should allow certain forms of Sharia law. I think that was a very foolish thing to say, but then he said it. And then it also is part of the prevailing multiculturalism that says all cultures are equally valid. That's wrong. All cultures are not equally valid. Some cultures discriminate against women, some cultures do not discriminate against women. It's not the case that all cultures are equally valid. We should respect all individuals as equally valuable, but not all cultures as equally valid. And so Muslims come into this society because we have this multicultural idea, have been enabled to establish their own subculture. So it's actually, rather than multiculturalism, it's like plural monoculturalism that we have. Trevor Phillips earlier this year said now that the integration of Muslims in this country is one of the biggest challenges the country has ever faced. Trevor Phillips, former head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who reckons he introduced the term Islamophobia into the country, the original coiner of that term, as he thought that was the problem with immigration of Muslims. He's now decided actually integration is, and we haven't done anything to help it. All we've done is actually facilitate them segregating into their own communities, into their own groups, and setting up their own systems and their own court system and now their own legal system. And then that means they don't integrate. And then we're ending up with what I've just called plural monoculturalism. You can go to some places in London or Bradford or Birmingham, and it's like walking into another culture. And the people there are living in another culture. In Birmingham alone, there are dozens of schools where it's 95% plus Muslim, both at secondary and primary level. So the people can grow up and go into an Islamic school and back into Islamic culture, never having really experienced or been challenged about their culture, or never having been in a wider cultural context. It's a monocultural system. Now, we need to work a lot harder at integrating them, and allowing these Sharia courts has been a big mistake.
And why has the previous British governments actually permitted the establishment of these Sharia courts? Because it really does undermine the very founding legal creation of the Magna Carta, which the principal quantum notes is that everyone is equal before the law. Is there not a great danger now with the implementation of these Sharia courts that we're actually undermining our entire legal system by having this parallel Islamic legal system running alongside it?
I totally agree with you, Simon. It is undermining the legal system, and it is in danger of creating a separate legal system and a status where if you're born into one of our cultures, you have different rights to if you're born into another of our cultures. And that's a problem, because then we're suddenly having two different cultures and two different systems, and it's unequal between those two. And actually what we need to do is stand firm and say, actually, no, in this country, women's rights are equal. I don't care where you were born or who you were born to. And if you're born in this country or if you've come into this country as well, you should have the same rights no matter what. And that's where we need to get to.
Absolutely. And also critics of Sharia law primarily say that they foster extremism, they undermine human rights, and they create a parallel justice system. And the basic conflicts of Sharia law conflict with British law. In what way do they foster extremism?
So it's been shown that the organisations, Islamic Sharia Council for one, that set up these courts in the first place are actually extremist in their interpretation of the Quran and in their interpretation of Sharia, and that they're much more fundamental than you might want to expect. And so these groups have done it deliberately in order to prevent integration, in order to encourage segregation, in order to promote a more strict interpretation of Sharia law and of the Quran and so on. And that, then allowing that to foster, allowing that to grow, then means that more people are interpreting the Quran in that way, interpreting Sharia law in that way, and understanding it in that way, and therefore you're fostering that kind of segregationist. This is what the extremists want. They want the segregation. They want the separation. They don't want people to assimilate. They want them to retain a strong Islamic identity within this community until they get bigger and bigger, and eventually they want to take us over. That's actually their plan, and in some cases you can find it in writing. And this is part of the agenda: is let's set up a separate legal system, a separate system, so that we can keep ourselves separate. And in some cases they're openly saying we don't go to the police, or we don't encourage you to go to the police, or the police is a last resort, and that sort of thing. In certain areas it's reported that hardly any crime is reported. Why is that? Because they're going to their own community to sort out the crime. And again, that's not equal before the law, if that's what's happening.
Absolutely. Also, can you give any kind of personal accounts of any stories that you've come across where women have been discriminated against, particularly involving marriages where they faced abusive marriages and violent marriages, and they want a divorce, and also that the husband they're married to could even have 3 or 4 wives?
Yes, so there are a number of stories like that I've read and come across, and some people that I've met as well, who have had abusive marriages of one kind or another, and they've gone to one of these Sharia courts, and in some cases they're told either return to your husband or return the children to him. Now you can see the problem there. The children are returned to him, so-called returned to him. They're in severe danger of being abducted by him and taken back to their country of origin, or just taken somewhere else. And she doesn't want to return to him because there's abuse involved in this marriage. And so where is she left? She hasn't got an option. It's very difficult there. And I know people who've gone into these Sharia courts and experienced them openly discriminating, openly saying your voice is not worth as much as a man's voice, and so on. There are a number of stories. If you go to the Equal and Free website, there are a number of stories there, and reports of lots of stories there, and many people. There's now 2 books written that are sort of scholarly tomes by people who've been into these courts. Maktel Z has written 1 book, Choosing Sharia ? And Professor Manea has written another book. I forgot what that's called just now, but anyway, it's which is about these courts, and she's been in the courts and interviewed the people in the courts as well.
Now, the government, particularly the Home Office in particular, has issued a review when Theresa May was then our Home Secretary. It was launched in May,
Yep.
And which they are now doing an investigation, independent inquiry into the operation of Sharia courts in the UK. What are you expecting that inquiry to show, and will it recommend that Sharia courts should be closed down in the UK as a matter of principle?
Well, so I'm pleased that the government wants to do a review into these Sharia courts. Unfortunately, I think they've gone about it the wrong way. So the person heading it is a theologian, not a judge, not a human rights person. They have got 2 imams on the panel, so 2 Muslim theologians who will be prone to support the influence of Sharia law, and 2 other legal people, but not experts in human rights. So there's been a lot of complaints about just the makeup of the panel. There's nobody with expertise in human rights on that panel, and human rights is very much part of what this is about here, and very much part of what the objection is to this, that human rights in terms of the equality and status of women in these courts is undermined. And nobody with human rights expertise or human rights experience is in there to look at that and bring that expertise there. I think that's a problem, and it's been criticised for that. The person heading it is not a judge, not a legal person with that level of independence. It's much more a theological person. They've got these 2 imams. And so the makeup of the panel is a problem, and then also the terms of reference are a problem as well, because the terms of reference are more about how can we look at what best practice is or the best ways of doing this and that sort of thing, rather than whether we should have them at all, or what the issues are, what the problems are for society around it, what the human rights issues are with it, that sort of thing. So it's been criticised quite sharply by a wide range of human rights organisations and groups who have concerns about the operation of these courts. In fact, they wrote an open letter to the then Home Secretary about this, making these points, which you can find online, which makes these various points, and they got no response. So then they called on these organisations to boycott the review, which is very significant. I mean, there's dozens of human rights organisations who've said we should boycott this review now. That's very significant. That's a real problem for it. I mean, I think it now lacks credibility. And then Professor Emea herself said, I will boycott it. Now, she's written one of the leading books on this, Women in Sharia Law, all about courts in this country. She's an expert, a leading expert on it. She said, I'm going to boycott this review now because I don't think it has the right people on it. I don't think it has the right credibility. I think the terms of reference are all wrong, and therefore I'm not going to involve myself in it. Now, if you've got senior academics like that saying, I will boycott this review, then the review clearly lacks credibility. It's clearly not going to be listened to in the first place.
Absolutely. We're down to the last 3 minutes of the programme, so I just got 2 last questions. One, can you tell us about Baroness Cox's bill on this issue of Sharia courts? And secondly, what can our viewers do in order to campaign against the practice of Sharia courts in the UK?
Okay, so Baroness Cox's bill has been through the House of Lords and wants to go into the House of Commons, but I think it needs to go through the House of Lords again now to get to that stage. That's how Parliament works. But Baroness Cox's bill would seek to put a stop to some of these problems. It would make it explicitly an offence to make any ruling in a way in which discriminates against women. So it's a very clever bill because it doesn't mention Sharia law or Islam anywhere in it, but just sort of makes that statement there. It would also make an offence to falsely claim jurisdiction. So if they're making a ruling that is actually about some level of abuse or child custody or inheritance, something like that should be covered by English law, then that would be clearly an offence and they shouldn't be allowed to do it. So it basically addresses this problem and would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for Sharia courts to actually operate. So it's a great bill. It's been through the House of Lords, got widespread support. I was at the third reading of it in the House of Lords, and only one person spoke against it, and all the other Lords that spoke very powerfully in favour of this bill. So the government should adopt it. Now, the government obviously is wanting to wait for this review now. I think that they should abandon the review and start again, really. But anyway, this would be the right way forward. We should encourage the government to take this on. If you get a chance to speak to your MP or write to your MP and say, why doesn't the government adopt this bill and take it forward, it's got every right to do so, having got all the support in the House of Lords. And go to equalandfree.org. You'll find all the details about it there.
Excellent. And very briefly, is there any chance that this will become law, UK law? Baroness Cox's bill that she's...
There is chance, but it needs either to come through as a private member's bill or for the government to support it and decide to prioritise it in their legislation. One or other of those could happen. Pending the review, the government's unlikely to adopt it. So then maybe it could come through as a private member's bill instead.
Tim, I just want to thank you so much for coming on Politics Today to explain this very important story about the role of Sharia courts and the implementation of Sharia law in the UK and how this is essentially against the British legal system and our very freedoms.
Thank you very much.
And keep up the excellent work you're doing with Christian Concern. We're a big fan of what you do.
Thank you. It's great.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. As you can see in this programme, there's a real danger in this country that we've seen the growth and the rise of Sharia courts in this country. It's important that we don't allow a parallel legal system to run side our legal system, and it's important that we protect the rights of women and vulnerable children, and this is why we should be campaigning against Sharia courts in the UK by supporting Baroness Cox's bill. So thank you for watching today's Politics Today.